The evening sun cast long shadows across the police station's worn steps as Detective James Morrison wrapped up another successful day. His desk, cluttered with case files and family photos, told the story of his 15 years on the force. A fresh cup of coffee steamed beside his keyboard as he typed up his final report of the day. Through the office window, he could see kids playing basketball at the community center he'd helped establish 3 years ago. The sight brought a tired smile to his face. That center had done more to reduce youth crime in the neighborhood than any number of arrests could have. Local shop owners would often wave to him during his patrols, and elderly residents knew they could count on him to check on them during harsh weather. "Hey, detective," called out Officer Chen, a rookie he'd been mentoring. "That domestic violence case you handled last week?" The victim finally agreed to press charges. Said it was because of how you talked to her, made her feel safe. Morrison nodded, remembering the hours he'd spent building trust with the frightened woman, showing her pictures of his own daughter, proving that someone cared about what happened to her. These were the moments that reminded him why he'd become a cop in the first place. His phone buzzed, a text from his daughter Lily. "Dad, don't forget to pick up cake mix. It's baking day." Their Sunday baking tradition had started after her mom passed away from cancer 2 years ago. At first, it had been a disaster. 2 people who barely knew how to boil water trying to make cookies. Now, it was their special time together, even if half their creations still ended up slightly burned. As he gathered his things to leave, the chief stopped by his desk. "Morrison, that drug bust last month. The DA's office says your testimony was crucial. Conviction rates up 30% since you joined the narcotics division. Keep this up, and that detective sergeant position might have your name on it." Walking to his car, Morrison waved to Mrs. Kumar from the corner store. She insisted on pressing a paper bag of fresh samosas into his hands. Her way of thanking him for catching the teenagers who'd been vandalizing her store. The warmth of the food matched the warmth in his chest. This was what real police work was about, being part of the community, making a difference in people's lives. At home, Lily was already in her pajamas, homework spread across the kitchen table. "Dad, did you get the cake mix?" Her face fell when she realized he'd forgotten, but brightened again when she saw Mrs. Kumar's samosas. "Even better. Can you tell me the story about how you caught those vandals again?" Morrison hung up his badge and gun, carefully storing them away. As he helped Lily with her math homework, he thought about how proud his late wife would be of their daughter, straight as volleyball team captain and still finding time to volunteer at the local animal shelter. Later that night, after Lily had gone to bed, Morrison sat in his modest living room, looking at the wall of commendations he'd earned over the years. Each one represented lives helped, communities protected. The pay wasn't great. He still lived in the same small house he'd bought as a rookie, but he'd never wanted to be rich. Making detective had been enough of an achievement for a kid who grew up in foster homes. His phone buzzed again, a text from dispatch about a possible break-in at the community center. Morrison sighed, putting his jacket back on. Sleep would have to wait. This was the job, being there when people needed help, no matter the hour. As he drove through the quiet streets, he thought about all the changes he'd seen in this neighborhood. The reduced crime rates, the new businesses opening up, kids playing outside again. He'd been part of that change, had earned the community's trust one small interaction at a time. The report turned out to be nothing, just some kids who'd forgotten to lock up after basketball practice. Morrison knew their names, their families. Instead of scolding them, he took the time to shoot a few hoops, reminding them about responsibility while building the kind of rapport that made real community policing work. Driving home under the stars, Morrison felt content. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new cases to solve, new people to help. But for now, he was exactly where he needed to be, a good cop, a good father, a respected member of his community. He had no way of knowing that this simple, honest life was about to change forever. The case started like any other, a tip about drug shipments moving through the city's upscale harbor district. Morrison sipped his morning coffee as he reviewed the surveillance photos. Something about this one felt different, bigger than the usual street-level busts. 3 weeks of stakeouts had led him to a surprising discovery. The drugs weren't coming through the usual channels, but through shipping containers registered to Rivercrest Industries, one of the city's most prestigious companies. Its owner, Richard Thompson, regularly appeared in charity galas and city council meetings. Late one night, as Morrison dug deeper into financial records, he found a pattern. Shell companies, suspicious bank transfers, all pointing to Thompson. But what caught his eye were the names connected to these transactions, including his own police commissioner and 2 city council members. Detective Morrison. The captain's voice startled him. A word in my office. The hallway to the captain's office had never seemed so long. Inside, the captain wasn't alone. Deputy Chief Williams stood by the window, his face unreadable. Outstanding work on the harbor investigation, the captain began, shuffling some papers. But we need to discuss your approach. The deputy chief turned from the window. Thompson's companies employ thousands in this city. The tax revenue alone funds half our department's budget. Morrison felt his stomach tighten. Sir, the evidence clearly shows. The evidence, the deputy chief interrupted softly, needs careful interpretation. Think about the bigger picture. A scandal like this could cost hundreds of honest people their jobs, including police jobs. Budget cuts would hit community programs first. That center you're so proud of wouldn't last a month. The captain slid a file across the desk. Here's a revised version of your report. Focus on the lower-level distributors. Sometimes protecting the greater good means making strategic choices. That night, Morrison sat in his car outside the station for an hour. The revised report felt heavy in his back. Through his windshield, he watched Officer Chen playing basketball with some kids at the community center. His phone lit up with a text from Lily. Dad, got my college acceptance letter. His heart swelled, then sank. The scholarship hadn't come through. They'd discussed student loans just last week. State college salaries didn't go far, especially with medical bills still piling up from his wife's treatment. The next morning, Morrison walked past Thompson's company building on his way to court. Clean lines, gleaming windows, respectable people going about respectable business. A young mother pushed a stroller past him, a toddler waving at his badge. The community center would need a new roof before winter. In court, Morrison testified. He stuck to the revised report, watched as small-time dealers got sentenced while Thompson sat in his office, planning his next charity gala. That evening, the captain congratulated him on his professional handling of the case. A week later, an envelope appeared in Morrison's desk drawer. Inside was a letter confirming a full scholarship for Lily from the Thompson Educational Foundation. The captain walked by, nodding slightly. Good things happened to team players Morrison. That night, Lily showed him brochures of the university's science program, her eyes shining with dreams of becoming a doctor like her mom. Morrison helped her plan which courses to take, each excited word from her mouth feeling like both a blessing and a weight on his conscience. Later, alone in his living room, Morrison stared at his wall of commendations. He thought about the choice he'd made, tried to convince himself it was just one case, just one time. The greater good, they'd said. He protected jobs, protected the community center, protected his daughter's future. But as he finally drifted off to sleep, his wife's photo on the bedside table seemed to watch him with disappointed eyes. In his dreams, the lines between right and wrong weren't so blurry. In his dreams, he was still the cop who'd never had to justify looking the other way. The next morning, he drove to work along his usual route. Everything looked the same streets, the same people, the same badge on his chest. But something had shifted, something invisible but essential. As he walked into the station, he didn't realize he'd just taken the first step down a path that would change everything. The first time Morrison accepted money directly, it was from a small-time club owner who'd been cited for noise violations. Just a few $100s to lose the paperwork. It seemed harmless enough. The club provided jobs, kept kids off streets. The cash helped pay for Lily's new laptop for college. Soon, word spread quietly through certain circles. Detective Morrison could be reasonable when approached the right way. The payments grew larger, the favors more serious. A businessman's son caught with illegal substances, case dismissed. A restaurant chain needing health inspections overlooked, problems disappeared. Each compromise came with a story Morrison told himself about helping the community, protecting jobs, ensuring stability. His bank account swelled. He moved Lily to a better apartment near her university, bought her a reliable car. "Dad, this is too much," she'd said, but he brushed off her concerns. "I got a bonus at work, honey. You deserve this." The lie tasted bitter, but her smile made it easier to swallow. At the station, Morrison's new designer suits and luxury watch didn't go unnoticed. "Must be investing wisely," he'd joke when asked. His solve rate remained impressive. Easy to do when you could choose which crimes to solve and which to ignore. The captain gave him knowing looks but said nothing. After all, the department's funding had never been better, thanks to generous donations from grateful business owners. One rainy evening, Thompson himself requested a meeting. Over expensive whiskey in a private club, he offered Morrison a proposition: become his personal security consultant. The salary would be paid through legitimate channels, disguised as advisory fees. "You're already part of the family," Thompson said, sliding a contract across the table. "Might as well make it official." Morrison thought about refusing, drawing a line. But he looked around the club. At the powerful people nodding respectfully at him, at the way the staff rushed to serve him. This wasn't the dirty back-alley corruption he'd once despised. This was business, networking, being smart about opportunities. He signed the contract. At home, Morrison installed a high-end security system, bought a safe for his growing collection of cash and gifts. His old friends from the academy stopped calling, or maybe he'd stopped answering. His new friends drove expensive cars and talked about offshore accounts and investment opportunities. The community center still got its funding, more than ever. Morrison made sure of that. He told himself he was doing more good now than before. A percentage of drug money diverted to after-school programs. Protection payments funding sports equipment. The ends justified the means. But sometimes, late at night, he'd catch his reflection in his bedroom mirror and see a stranger. The honest cop who'd worked his way up from nothing seemed like a character in someone else's story. He'd deleted his old photos, packed away his early commendations. They belonged to a different man. Lily called less frequently now. Their Sunday conversations felt strained. "You sound different, Dad," she said once. "Is everything okay?" He assured her it was fine, promised to visit soon. But he kept finding reasons to postpone. It was harder to look her in the eye. One morning, Morrison pulled over a driver for speeding. Old habit, he usually ignored traffic violations now. The man, nervous, offered him cash on the spot. Morrison almost laughed. Amateur. He explained how things really worked: monthly payments, proper channels, professional courtesy. When had this become so normal? His phone buzzed constantly now. People needing favors, offering deals, seeking protection. He hired an accountant to manage his consulting income, bought a boat, started dating a young real estate agent who didn't ask questions about his work. At police functions, younger officers sought his advice. He taught them the art of looking the other way, dressed up in words like discretion and community relations. Some eagerly followed his example. Others stopped meeting his eyes in the hallway. The money felt clean now. His conscience, calloused over, rarely bothered him. But sometimes, driving past his old neighborhood, past the kids playing basketball who no longer waved at his car, Morrison felt a hollow ache in his chest. He'd fill it with expensive dinners, designer clothes, the rush of power that came with each new deal. One night, reviewing his monthly earnings, Morrison realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd solved a real case, helped someone who genuinely needed it. But that was okay, he told himself. He was beyond that now. The simple cop who'd believed in protecting and serving had grown up, learned how the world really worked. Besides, there was no going back. He had too many secrets to protect, too many powerful friends to satisfy. The path he'd chosen had become a highway, and he was accelerating, destination unknown. The change in Morrison's approach to police work happened so gradually that at first, no one noticed. A shove here, a threatening comment there. The old Morrison would have talked things through, found peaceful solutions. The new Morrison found that fear worked faster. During a routine questioning, he grabbed a suspect's collar, slammed him against the wall. The young officer with him, Reynolds, looked shocked. "That's how you get results," Morrison explained later in the break room. "Sometimes you need to show them who's in charge." Reynolds nodded slowly, taking notes. His reputation shifted. People in the neighborhood no longer waved. They hurried inside when his car passed. Store owners who once offered him coffee now just stared at the floor. Morrison told himself this was better. Respect through fear meant more control, more power. The captain called him in one morning. "Complaints are up, Morrison." But it wasn't a reprimand. The captain seemed impressed. "And confession rates are way up too. Whatever you're doing, keep it up. Just keep it within limits." They both knew limits had become a flexible term. At a crime scene, Morrison watched Reynolds copy his aggressive questioning style with a witness. "Good job, kid," he said afterward. "You're learning." 5 years ago, he would have reported such behavior. Now he was teaching it. Other young officers started following his example, forming a tight group that handled special cases. His phone rang during dinner. Lily, calling from college. "Dad, I saw your name in the student paper. They're saying you hurt someone during an arrest. That can't be true, right?" He changed the subject, asked about her classes. Later, he made some calls, had the article removed. Just another problem solved with money and influence. The community center's basketball court stood empty most days now. Parents kept their kids away when police cars were around. Morrison drove past, remembering the old days of shooting hoops with neighborhood kids. Those memories felt like they belonged to someone else. During a drug raid, a suspect raised his hands, trying to explain. Morrison didn't wait for words. The takedown was rough, unnecessary. His team watched, then followed his lead with the other suspects. Back at the station, paperwork made it all look clean, professional. The right words, the right phrases. Officer Chen, his former mentee, requested a transfer to another precinct. "This isn't what you taught me," Chen said quietly while cleaning out his locker. Morrison wanted to explain how the world really worked, but Chen wouldn't understand. Idealists never did. The police union meeting brought praise for his unit's performance. Record numbers, they said. Nobody mentioned the increasing hospital visits by suspects, the growing fear in the community. Success had its own language now, measured in arrests and seizures rather than trust and protection. His new apartment overlooked the city. From up high, everything looked orderly, controlled. The same way he liked his streets, quiet, compliant. The old photos of him with community members, coaching youth basketball, helping at neighborhood cleanups, all packed away in boxes he never opened. One evening, a rookie officer questioned his methods during an interrogation. Morrison pulled him aside afterward. "Listen, kid, there are 2 types of cops, those who get things done and those who get nowhere. Choose wisely." The rookie fell in line. They always did now. The local news ran a story about changing police tactics in his precinct. Morrison watched it from his leather couch, drinking expensive scotch. They'd used words like controversial and aggressive, but the crime stats spoke for themselves. Lower reported crime rates. Nobody asked how those numbers got so low. His daughter's latest text sat unanswered on his phone. "Dad, can we talk? I'm worried about you." He'd reply later, make up some excuse about being busy with work. The truth was, he couldn't remember how to talk to her anymore, couldn't bridge the gap between who he'd been and who he'd become. At night, patrolling his territory, that's how he thought of it now. Morrison felt like a different species from the people behind the locked doors and drawn curtains. He was above them, beyond them. The power that had once felt strange now felt natural, necessary. The wall of commendations in his office had been replaced with performance charts and arrest statistics. Each spike represented another boundary pushed, another line crossed. But Morrison didn't see lines anymore, just obstacles to be overcome, resistance to be crushed. Everything was simpler now. No more community meetings, no more social work pretending to be police work. Just pure authority, pure control. And if someone got hurt along the way, well, that's what happened when people didn't follow the rules, his rules. It started as a routine call on a quiet Tuesday morning. A shopkeeper reported suspicious activity behind his store. Nothing special, the kind of call Morrison usually passed to junior officers. But he was in the area, and something made him take this one personally. The suspect was young, barely 20, wearing a college sweatshirt. He tried to explain he was just taking a shortcut to class. 5 years ago, Morrison would have listened. 3 years ago, he might have at least checked the kid's story. But now? Now he saw only defiance in those raised hands, only lies in that nervous voice. What happened next took less than 2 minutes. Morrison's training, his experience, everything that once made him a good cop, it all vanished in a burst of rage. When he finally stepped back, the kid wasn't moving, just curled up on the ground, whimpering. Then Morrison heard it, the distinctive sound of phone cameras. Looking up, he saw at least 3 people recording from different angles. One was a high school student he recognized from the community center's better days. Another was Mrs. Kuma's grandson. The third was a local news reporter who'd stopped for coffee. Within an hour, the videos were everywhere. Local news, social media, national broadcasts, each showing the same thing. A respected detective attacking an unarmed college student who, it turned out, was exactly what he claimed to be. A Dean's List student late for his morning class. The chief suspended him immediately, pending investigation. Morrison sat in his luxury apartment, watching his phone explode with messages. His lawyer warning him to say nothing. Thompson distancing himself. The captain expressing disappointment in his judgment. But it was the text from Lily that hit hardest. "I saw the video, Dad. That student? He's in my study group. How could you?" Internal affairs moved fast. Too fast. They'd been waiting for this, Morrison realized. All those complaints he'd dismissed, all those incidents he'd covered up, they had a file ready. And now they had video evidence they couldn't ignore. Former allies scattered like leaves in a storm. Officers he'd mentored in his aggressive tactics suddenly couldn't recall specific incidents. The captain developed a convenient case of amnesia about authorizing Morrison's methods. Even Thompson's lawyer called to terminate his consulting contract. Morrison's new lawyer, paid for with his dwindling savings, looked grim during their meetings. "The video's bad," he said. "But what's worse is what it's bringing out. People are talking now. All the complaints we buried, they're resurfacing. And some of your former business associates are eager to make deals." The media dug deeper. Stories emerged, years of complaints, suspicious bank transactions, connections to Thompson's empire. Reporters camped outside his building. Old photos appeared in news articles, Morrison at community events, smiling with residents who now lined up to share stories about how he changed, how he betrayed their trust. Officer Chen gave an interview. "He taught me what a good cop should be, then showed me what a cop should never become." The words stung more than any police investigation. Lily stopped taking his calls. Through mutual friends, he heard she'd changed her major to criminal justice reform. His own daughter, turning his disgrace into her cause. The community center held a meeting about police brutality. Through the window, Morrison watched his former neighbors share stories about him, how he'd started as their protector and ended as their tormentor. Mrs. Kumar spoke about watching him change, about warning her grandchildren to avoid him. Every word was a nail in the coffin of his reputation. His expensive apartment felt like a prison now. The view of the city he'd once dominated now mocked him. At night, he'd replay that 2-minute video, watching himself become the very thing he'd sworn to fight against when he first put on the badge. The investigation expanded. Federal agents got involved, following money trails, uncovering connections. Morrison's carefully constructed world of power and influence crumbled like a house of cards in a hurricane. His lawyer called with an offer: cooperate, name names, reduce his sentence. The same deal he'd offered to countless others over the years. Now he understood why some had cried when accepting it. The worst part wasn't the coming punishment. It wasn't losing his badge, his freedom, or even his daughter's respect. It was catching his reflection in the window of the Internal Affairs office and finally seeing what everyone else had seen, not a cop who'd lost his way, but a bully with a badge who'd chosen to become a monster. The student he'd attacked gave a press conference from his hospital bed. No anger, no calls for revenge. Just quiet words about healing, about hope for change. Morrison watched it on his living room TV, surrounded by packed boxes, evidence being collected by investigators. The kid's forgiveness felt worse than any punishment the court could devise. The investigation room felt smaller each time Morrison sat in it. Today marked his 15th interview with Internal Affairs. Outside, autumn leaves fell past the window, marking time's steady march toward his inevitable fate. "Let's talk about Thompson's donations to the department," the investigator said, sliding another document across the table. Morrison recognized his own signature, authorizing equipment purchases that never happened. The paper trail he'd once thought clever now seemed embarrassingly obvious. His new department-appointed lawyer looked tired. They both knew each revelation only deepened the hole Morrison had dug for himself. Former associates were cutting deals daily, each one offering another piece of the corruption puzzle. The club owner who'd made the first payment years ago testified about their arrangement. In exchange for immunity, he provided recordings, Morrison's voice discussing payoffs, threatening consequences. Insurance, the club owner called it. Morrison remembered teaching others to do the same. Now those lessons were evidence against him. His phone hadn't rung in weeks, no more desperate people seeking favors, no more powerful friends offering opportunities. The silence felt deafening. His social media accounts disappeared one by one as former contacts distanced themselves. Even his favorite restaurant, where he'd once dined for free, had his photo posted in the kitchen, "Do not serve." Officer Reynolds, his former protege, gave a detailed statement about Morrison's teaching methods. "He showed us how to make problems disappear," Reynolds testified. Said it was part of being a modern cop. The young officer's voice shook as he described specific incidents, dates, names. Morrison had taught him too well about keeping records. The investigation spread like wildfire through the department. Officers Morrison had mentored in his aggressive tactics now faced their own inquiries. Some broke down during questioning, revealing years of learned behavior. Each confession traced back to Morrison's influence, his systematic corruption of proper police work. His apartment building's management asked him to leave, politely but firmly. "Other residents feel uncomfortable," they explained. Morrison packed his belongings into boxes, most of which would soon be marked as evidence. The luxury furniture, the expensive art, all of it would be seized as proceeds of corruption. Local news ran a special report, "The Fall of Detective Morrison." They interviewed his old neighbors, showed clips of him at community events years ago. The contrast between then and now was stark. They even found footage of him teaching kids at the community center, his face bright with genuine purpose. The reporter's voiceover called it a tragic transformation. Thompson's lawyer contacted him one last time, not to help, but to warn him against mentioning certain meetings, certain arrangements. The threat was polite, professional, and absolutely clear. Morrison realized he'd never really been part of their world, he'd just been their tool. The worst came when Internal Affairs showed him Lurley's statement. His daughter's words, carefully typed on official paper, detailed everything she'd noticed over the years. The sudden wealth, the changing attitude, the missing explanations. She'd kept a journal, documenting her father's transformation with a lawyer's attention to detail. "I started writing it all down the day Dad laughed about hurting someone during arrest," her statement read. "I knew then that I'd eventually need to tell the truth about what he'd become." His former partner, retired now, visited him at his temporary apartment. They sat in silence for a while before the old cop spoke. "I saw it happening," he said. "We all did, but you were so good at explaining it away, making wrong sound right. That was always your real talent." The evidence mounted daily. Financial records revealed hundreds of suspicious transactions. Former suspects came forward with stories of threats and beatings. Business owners admitted to years of protection payments. Each new revelation made the previous ones seem worse, painting a picture of systematic abuse of power. Morrison spent hours watching old videos of himself, award ceremonies, community meetings, press conferences. In each one, he could now see the subtle changes. The growing arrogance in his smile, the hardening in his eyes, the way his uniform gradually became a costume for power rather than service. The prosecutor offered a deal: plead guilty, testify against Thompson and the others, get a reduced sentence. The alternative was facing every charge they'd uncovered. The list of charges filled 3 pages. Even with the deal, he'd serve serious time. Late one night, Morrison drove past the community center one last time. The basketball court was full of kids playing under the lights. A new officer stood chatting with parents, building the kind of trust Morrison had once valued. Through the window, he saw Officer Chen teaching a youth police workshop, carrying on the real work of community policing that Morrison had abandoned. As he parked outside the federal building the next morning, ready to accept the plea deal, Morrison caught his reflection in his car window. His expensive suit, once a symbol of success, now looked like a costume worn by a man who'd lost his way. In his pocket, his badge felt heavier than ever, his last day carrying it before the formal surrender of his law enforcement credentials. The courthouse steps seemed endless that morning. Morrison's footsteps echoed in the marble hallway as he walked toward courtroom 3, where his sentencing would take place. His lawyer had prepared him for this day, but nothing felt real until he saw the packed gallery. Former colleagues filled the benches, some there to testify, others just to witness. Officer Chen sat near the front, next to Mrs. Kumar and her grandson. The college student he'd attacked was there too, supported by classmates. Morrison kept his eyes forward, focusing on the polished wood of the judge's bench. His lawyer's presentation felt distant, like background noise. Years of distinguished service, recent behavioral changes, willing to cooperate. The words bounced off the courtroom walls, hollow and meaningless against the weight of his actions. The prosecutor stood next, laying out the charges one by one. Each count was a chapter in Morrison's fall: corruption, excessive force, obstruction of justice. The list went on, each charge backed by evidence, testimonies, recordings. The systematic dismantling of a career built over decades, reduced to a catalogue of crimes. Then came the victim statements. Store owners described years of fear. Former suspects detailed encounters that had left them traumatized. Young officers explained how his influence had warped their understanding of police work. Each story added another brick to the wall of consequences he built around himself. The college student spoke last, his voice steady. "I used to want to be a police officer," he said. "Detective Morrison changed that. But he also taught me something important, that systems only work when good people stand up against abuse of power." Morrison had prepared a statement. The paper trembled slightly in his hands as he stood. "I'd had a lot of time to think about where things went wrong," he began. "The truth is, there wasn't one moment. It was 1,000 small choices, each one taking me further from who I was supposed to be." His voice caught when he saw Lily enter the courtroom. She sat in the back row, her face a mixture of sadness and determination. She'd cut her hair short, looked more grown-up than he remembered. She wore a badge too, not a police badge, but one identifying her as a law student focusing on police accountability. "I betrayed everything I once stood for," Morrison continued. "My badge, my community, my family. The people I was meant to protect became targets. The trust I spent years building became a weapon. I can't undo what I've done, but I can at least face the consequences." The judge's voice filled the courtroom. The sentence wasn't a surprise. They'd worked it out in the plea deal. Multiple years in federal prison, fines, restitution payments. His pension gone, his reputation destroyed. But it was the judge's words that cut deepest. "Mr. Morrison, your crimes are particularly severe because they didn't just break laws, they broke trust. Every officer who follows your example, every citizen who loses faith in law enforcement, every young person who sees police as enemies rather than protectors, that's part of your legacy now." As the bailiff approached with handcuffs, Morrison caught a final glimpse of the gathered faces. Officer Chen was already working to rebuild community trust in his old neighborhood. The college student was organizing police accountability workshops. His own daughter was channeling her pain into reforming the system he'd corrupted. In a way, Morrison thought, they were all carrying on his original mission, just not in the way he'd ever imagined. They'd learned from his failures, using his downfall as a foundation for positive change. His last view of freedom was through the window of a prison transport van. The city scrolled past. The community center where he'd once helped kids, the streets he'd once protected, the neighborhoods where people had once trusted him. Each familiar sight now felt like a reminder of what he'd lost. The prison intake process was deliberately humbling. His expensive suit was exchanged for standard clothing, his carefully maintained appearance stripped down to basic essentials. His new home would be a cell smaller than his former office, his new routine dictated by others' rules. That night, alone in his cell, Morrison found an unexpected kind of peace. The constant pressure of maintaining appearances, juggling lies, protecting his corrupt empire, it all fell away. For the first time in years, he didn't have to pretend to be something he wasn't. He received one letter that first week. Lily's handwriting, so much like her mother's. "Dad," she wrote, "what you did was wrong. But maybe some good can come from it. I'm working to make sure what happened with you never happens to another officer." That's my way of honoring who you used to be." The words echoed in his mind as he lay on his narrow bed, staring at the ceiling. His story was already being taught at the police academy, not as a hero's journey, but as a cautionary tale. His choices, his mistakes, his downfall, all of it became a lesson for future officers about the slow poison of corruption and the vital importance of staying true to their oath. In the end, Morrison's legacy would not be the commendations he'd won or the power he'd wielded, but the changes his fall inspired: stronger oversight, better training, renewed focus on community trust. His greatest contribution to law enforcement came not from his years of service, but from serving as a warning of how far the mighty could fall when they forgot their true purpose.